The spring of 1959 came late to Reno County, Kansas. It came the way it always did, not with warmth, but with mud. With gray mornings that smelled like wet earth and diesel, and the particular kind of cold that had no interest in leaving just because the calendar said April. The fields stretched flat in every direction, brown and bare and enormous, and the sky above them was the color of old tin. Harlan Voss stood at the edge of his land at 6 in the morning and looked at all of it. He was 31 years old. He had grown up on this ground. His father had grown up on ground 20 miles east of here. Same county, same sky, same silence. The Voss family had been planting winter wheat in Reno County since 1912.
You know the herd is
and in
worth
that
it.
time, they had learned one
Timing
central
ain't in your
truth
favor,
about this
Harlan.
particular piece of the
I
earth.
reckon we can wait.
It did not care about you. It had watched men arrive full of ambition and watched them leave with less than they came with, and it had never once changed its expression. Harlan understood this. He had always understood it. What he was holding in his jacket pocket that morning was something he had not yet told anyone about. Not his wife, not his neighbor, not the men at the feed store on Plum Street where he bought his seed invoices and drank bad coffee on Tuesday mornings. It was a folded piece of paper, a page torn from a government bulletin he had requested by mail in February after reading 4 sentences in a farm journal that most men had skipped entirely. He had read those 4 sentences 6 times before he picked up a pen and wrote the address of the USDA field office on an envelope. The bulletin had arrived 3 weeks later, 14 pages long, printed on paper so thin you could read the page behind it if you held it up to a window. He had read all 14 pages. Twice. That was what was in his jacket pocket. That and a decision he hadn't finished making yet. The farmhouse sat 300 yards back from the county road, 2 stories white paint going gray at the corners, a covered porch that faced east so you could drink your coffee and watch whatever weather was coming at you from that direction. Harlan's grandfather had built it in 1921. It had survived the drought years, 2 floods, 1 fire in the barn that took the north wall before they got it under control, and 38 winters of Kansas wind that tested every nail in its frame. The kitchen was where the Voss family did its real thinking. It was a large kitchen, the kind built for work rather than appearance, with a heavy wooden table in the center that had been in the same spot for so long the floor had worn slightly beneath its legs. There was a wall-mounted telephone to the left of the doorway. Below it, a narrow drawer that was supposed to hold important papers, but mostly held everything that couldn't be thrown away and didn't have anywhere else to go. Harlan had gone to that drawer at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday in January. He had been having trouble sleeping. Not the dramatic kind of sleeplessness, not anxiety, not dread, just the ordinary restlessness of a man whose mind kept working after the rest of him wanted to stop. He had gone downstairs in his wool socks and turned on the lamp over the kitchen table and opened the drawer to find something specific, a copy of a tractor payment schedule he thought he'd filed there. He found the tractor payment schedule. He also found the USDA bulletin. It was sandwiched between a seed catalog with a bright photograph of a Hereford bull on the cover and a financing notice from First National that still had its envelope. The seed catalog had been read twice. The financing notice had been opened and signed and nearly forgotten. The bulletin had never been opened at all. He sat down at the table. He sorted the drawer into 2 piles without quite deciding to things that mattered and things that didn't. The bulletin landed in the first pile because of 4 words printed in the executive summary on the inside front cover. Structural shift in domestic protein demand. He didn't know exactly what a structural shift meant in the economic sense, but he knew what protein demand was. He ran 40 head of cattle and he understood feeding cycles. And structural meant the floor was moving. Not the ceiling, the floor. He turned to page 4. Soybean meal consumption by domestic livestock was projected to increase from 8.2 million tons in 1958 to somewhere between 22 and 28 million tons by 1972. The drivers were specific broiler chicken expansion across the Southeast and a shift from pasture-fed to confinement-fed hog operations across the Midwest. Supply in the Central Plains remained critically underdeveloped. Harlan read that paragraph 3 times. Then he got up, opened the cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a brown paper grocery bag from Dillon's. He sat back down at the table. He got out a pencil. He wrote numbers for 40 minutes. At the bottom of the last column, he circled 2 words: plant soybeans. At 3:47 in the morning, he folded the bag in quarters, put it on top of the refrigerator, turned off the lamp, and went back upstairs. He said quietly in the dark to Mabel, I think I know what to do with the South Acres. Mabel did not open her eyes. She had been a light sleeper since before they were married, and she had heard him come downstairs and heard the drawer open and heard the silence that meant he was reading something. Is it the soybeans? She said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. How did you know? You've been pulling that government paper out for a month. You only read things that long when you're about to do something about them. He lay down. The ceiling was dark. Go to sleep, she said. He didn't sleep for another hour, but it was a different kind of awake, not restless, not searching. He had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic was clear. He was just letting himself catch up to what the numbers already knew. Mabel Voss was 30 years old that spring and had been married to Harlan for 7 years. She had grown up in Pratt County, 40 miles west, the daughter of a grain elevator operator who had taught her 3 things: how to read a balance sheet, how to identify when a man was hiding something from his own numbers, and how to make a proper pot of coffee in weather cold enough to freeze a waterline. She was not a woman who responded to ideas with enthusiasm. She responded to ideas with questions. The morning after Harlan's 2 a.m. arithmetic session, she came downstairs at 5:30 and found the paper bag on the table unfolded, covered in pencil figures, and Harlan standing at the stove with his back to her. She picked up the bag. She looked at the numbers for a long time. How much are we carrying on the equipment note? She said. 4,200. What's our break-even per bushel if we plant 280 acres? 163 at current input costs. The contract price I'm looking at is 211. She looked at the numbers again. She looked at his face, which had the particular expression she had learned to recognize over 7 years. Not excitement exactly, but a settled quality. The look of a man who has already decided and is now only waiting to say it out loud. The co-op won't take them, she said. Not in any volume. There's a crush plant expanding out of Wichita. I've been in touch. She set down the paper bag. All right, she said, but I'm keeping my garden. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a condition. It was simply a fact she wanted on the table, that there was one piece of this land that belonged to her in a way that had nothing to do with bushels per acre or forward contracts or USDA projections. The half-acre kitchen garden on the south side of the house, running from the porch steps to the old fence line, was hers. It had been hers since the first spring of their marriage, when she had broken the ground herself with a borrowed cultivator and planted tomatoes, beans, and 3 rows of sweet corn. Harlan understood what she meant by it. The garden stays, he said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him, and they went through the numbers together for another 40 minutes, Mabel asking questions and Harlan answering them until there were no more questions that either of them could think of. Then she collected the cups, set them in the sink, and went upstairs to get dressed. The paper bag went back on the table. Some things once calculated don't need to be recalculated. They just need to be started. In 1959, Reno County ran on wheat. It had run on wheat since before most of the men farming it were born, and the idea that it might run on anything else was not just unusual. It was the kind of unusual that made people laugh. Wheat was what the soil knew. Wheat was what the grain elevators were built for. Wheat was what your father had planted and his father before him, and the county co-op priced and stored and talked about in the way people talk about something so fundamental it has stopped seeming like a choice. The 3 soybean operations in the county were treated as curiosities, small, managed by men who were generally regarded as having made an interesting hobby out of farming. Nobody begrudged them. Nobody followed them either. Harlan had ordered his soybean seed on the 3rd of April. 4,800 pounds of it loaded on a flatbed in Wichita, arriving in 11 days. He had not told anyone. Not the men at the Tuesday morning coffee counter at Kelsey's Feed and Supply on Plum Street, where he had been buying his inputs since he was 19 years old. Not Cleet Pruitt, who farmed 400 acres of winter wheat on the section directly north of Harlan's property, and who had lived on that land his entire life, and who considered himself a reasonable authority on what Reno County would and would not support. Not Gus Fenner, who had 600 acres 3 miles north, and a particular way of leaning against the counter at Kelsey's that suggested he had already heard whatever you were about to say and had opinions about it. Harlan was not a secretive man by nature. He was a quiet man, which is different. He spoke when he had something specific to say and was comfortable with the silences between. It was a quality that some people misread as coldness and others recognized eventually as discipline. What happened on the Tuesday morning in the second week of April was not planned. He had come in for a seed invoice, a routine stop 5 minutes in and out. He was standing at the counter, signing the slip, when Gus Fenner asked him in the casual way of a man making conversation how he was thinking about the South 40 this year. Harlan said he was thinking about putting it in soybeans. He said it the way you say something when you forget for one unguarded moment that you weren't planning to say it yet. Cleet Pruitt set his coffee cup down on the counter. He set it down slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants the gesture itself to communicate something before he says the words. Soybeans, Cleet said, in Reno County. That's right, Harlan said. Cleet looked at Gus Fenner. Gus Fenner looked at the two other men standing near the seed display. One of them, a third-generation wheat farmer named Burl Crandall, who hadn't changed his rotation since 1941, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Cleet said, Harlan, my hogs eat better than soybean meal. The men at the counter laughed, not cruelly the way men laugh at something they genuinely find ridiculous, which in its own way is worse than cruelty, because it doesn't leave room for argument. You can argue with a man who's angry. You can't argue with 5 men who think you've already answered your own question by asking it. Harlan signed the invoice. He said nothing. He walked out of Kelsey's Feed and Supply, got into his truck, and drove south on County Road 17 toward the farm where 4,800 pounds of soybean seed were arriving in 11 days. Sitting in the truck, he was not angry. He was not rattled. He was something closer to confirmed because the same men who had just laughed at him had received the same 14-page USDA bulletin in the same plain envelope, sandwiched between the same seed catalog and the same financing notices, and not one of them had opened it. He had read it. They had not. That was the whole of it. The seed arrived on a flatbed on April 12th, driven by a man from a Wichita supplier who had never made a delivery to Reno County for soybeans before, and said so not unkindly while Harlan helped him unload. 2 days later, on April 14th, Harlan drove the planter into the first field before sunup. His hired hand, a young man named Denny Stills, who had worked for Harlan for 2 seasons and was competent and reasonably reliable, had quit the week before. His father had told him at dinner that working for Harlan Voss on a soybean operation was the kind of thing that followed a man around, that it reflected on his judgment, that in a county where everyone knew everyone, the associations a young man made early in his life had a way of sticking. Denny had given Harlan 3 days' notice and apologized twice and meant it both times. Harlan had told him he understood and paid him through the end of the week. Then he had gotten into the cab of the planter alone. He drove 14 hours the first day. He stopped twice, once to refuel and once to eat a sandwich standing in the field, looking back at the rows he'd already put in, checking the spacing by eye. The spacing was good. The soil was dry enough to work. The temperature was 48 degrees and the wind was low, which was as good as April in Kansas ever got. He drove 14 hours the second day, and the third, and the fourth. He planted 280 acres in soybeans. He kept 40 acres in winter wheat, not because he doubted the arithmetic, but because he had a wife and 2 daughters, and daughters had costs that didn't care about your conviction in a commodity projection. 40 acres of wheat was not a hedge against the idea. It was a hedge against the gap between a good idea and a proven one. Of the 280 soybean acres, 18 in the southwest corner were already showing poor germination by the end of April, a drainage problem he had identified in March and had not been able to fully correct before planting. That left 262 productive acres going into May. He noted it without panic. He had expected it. The notebook had told him that section was a risk before the seed ever went in the ground, and the soil had confirmed what the notebook predicted. On the 4th evening, Harlan came in from the field at 8 o'clock, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table without speaking. Mabel set a plate in front of him. She sat down across from him with her coffee. All in, she said. All in, he said. She nodded once. Outside, 280 acres of soybean seeds sat in the ground of Reno County, Kansas, in the dark and the cold, doing the only thing that seeds know how to do. 3 days after the planting was finished, Harlan drove to Wichita. He had made the appointment by telephone 2 weeks earlier, introduced himself to the secretary as a farmer from Reno County, interested in procurement terms, and been given a time slot on a Wednesday afternoon. He drove 90 miles in his truck, parked in a lot he'd never parked in before, and walked through the front door of a soybean crush facility that was in the middle of expanding its procurement network westward into the Central Plains. The plant manager was a man named Merle Ashby. He was 52 broad through the shoulders, with the manner of a man who had spent his career in industrial agriculture and had learned to tell very quickly whether the person sitting across from him was worth his time. Harlan sat down. He said, "I have 280 acres of soybeans in the ground in Reno County. I expect to harvest somewhere between 8 and 9,000 bushels in October. I'd like to talk about a forward contract." Merle Ashby had never had a farmer from Reno County walk through his door before. He said so. "I know," Harlan said. They talked for 40 minutes. Merle asked about soil conditions, drainage, seeding rate, variety selection. Harlan answered every question with numbers, not estimates, numbers with the reasoning behind them. At the end of the 40 minutes, Merle Ashby offered a forward contract at $2.11 per bushel for up to 8,000 bushels delivery in October with standard moisture and grade conditions. Harlan signed it. He drove 90 miles home with the contract folded in his jacket pocket, the same pocket where the page from the USDA bulletin had been riding since April. He told Mabel that evening. She read the contract at the kitchen table. She asked about the grade conditions in the delivery window and what happened if the harvest came in under 8,000 bushels. Harlan answered each question. She folded the contract and handed it back. "All right," she said. "Now we wait." She did not ask whether he was going to tell Clete Pruitt. She already knew the answer to that. By the middle of May, Reno County had formed an opinion about what Harlan Voss was doing, and the opinion was not favorable. Clete Pruitt drove past the South Fields 3 times in a single week and reported back at Kelsey's counter that the rows looked sideways in the northwest corner, and the plant stand was thin in the low sections near the property line. This was partially accurate. Harlan had lost those 18 acres in the drainage problem he had already documented and planned around, but Clete reported it as though the entire field was collapsing. "I give him till July," Clete told the Tuesday morning counter on a morning when Harlan was not there. "Soybeans in this county. You'd think a man would ask around before he threw his whole operation at something nobody in the area has proven out." Gus Fenner said he'd give him till the 1st of June. Burl Crandall said nothing, which in his case meant agreement. What none of them knew, what none of them had any reason to know, was that Harlan had already been in the field that morning before any of them had sat down with their coffee. He had walked the northeast sections in the early light, checking emergence, crouching down to look at the seedlings pushing through the soil crust in the A and B sections where the drainage was good and the topsoil ran deep. The seedlings in A section were even and strong and exactly where they were supposed to be. He had pulled out the first green notebook, a composition book with a stiff cardboard cover that he had bought at the Rexall on Main Street for 35 cents, and written the date at the top of a clean page. Below it, he wrote Section A, Emergence Uniform, Stand Good. Section D, Poor germination drainage issue confirmed as projected. 18 acres lost, 14 recoverable with replant at higher seeding rate. Action required this week. He noted the temperature. He noted the soil moisture at 2 inches. He noted the wind direction. He closed the notebook. He walked back to the truck as the sun came up over the flat line of the eastern field, and the whole county stretched out around him brown and vast and absolutely indifferent. And the 31-year-old farmer, who everyone at Kelsey's Feed and Supply had already decided was going to fail, drove home along the county road with a notebook full of observations and a forward contract in his glove box, and 4,800 pounds of seeds doing their quiet work in the dark ground beneath his wheels. He was not afraid. He was not certain either. Certainty was a luxury for men who didn't bother to check their numbers. But he had read the bulletin. He had done the arithmetic. He had signed the contract. The seed was in the ground. What happened next was the field's business. His business was the notebook. The first green notebook filled up by the end of June. Harlan bought a second one at the Rexall on Main Street, same composition book, same stiff cardboard cover, 35 cents. He labeled the spine in his small compact cursive 1959 Volume 2 and put it on the shelf above the kitchen desk next to the first one and started writing in it the same evening. By the time October came, he had filled 3. Nobody in Reno County knew the notebooks existed. That was not by design. Harlan had not made a decision to hide them. It simply had not occurred to anyone to ask what he was doing in the evenings after supper, and it had not occurred to him to explain it. The notebooks were a working tool the same as the planter or the soil probe or the moisture gauge he kept in the truck. You did not explain your tools to the men at the feed store counter. You used them. The system he had built inside those notebooks was not complicated. It was thorough. He had divided his 262 productive acres into 11 sections labeled A through K, each with its own page header and its own running log. The division was based on soil characteristics he had mapped in March by digging 47 test holes across the property, using a post hole digger and a set of mason jars that Mabel had labeled in her careful handwriting. 6 samples had gone to the Kansas State Extension Lab. The rest he had evaluated himself, reading color and texture, and running a pH test from a method he had found in a library book, white vinegar for high pH baking soda solution, for low the reaction, telling him what he needed to know. Without the cost of a lab fee, he couldn't justify that year. This was not how farmers in Reno County operated. Most men walked their fields by feel and memory, guided by what their fathers had done in the same ground, under the same sky, and there was a kind of accumulated wisdom in that which should not be dismissed. 40 years of watching the same soil through wet springs and dry summers built an intuition that no bulletin could fully replace. But intuition could not tell you that Section D had a clay pan at 14 inches that was holding water 3 days after a rain, while Section B 60 yards north was draining clean in 24 hours. The test holes told you that. The jars told you that. The notebook told you what to do about it. Section D was his problem from the beginning. 22 acres in the southwest corner topsoil, running shallow over tight clay that had no interest in releasing water in any direction at any reasonable speed. He had lost the 18 germination acres there in April. By June, he had replanted 14 of them at a higher seeding rate, accepting the higher seed cost as the price of the drainage problem he had not fully solved before planting. He noted in the Volume 2 notebook Section D replant: higher input cost, stand uneven, yield projection reduced, drainage correction required before 1960 season, regardless of outcome this year. That last phrase, regardless of outcome this year, was the key to how Harlan Voss thought about everything. He was already designing 1960 while 1959 was still in the ground. He was not waiting to see whether this worked before he planned for what came next. The planning was not contingent on the result. The result would inform the planning, but the planning never stopped. By July, the notebooks had 40 pages of observations across 11 sections, and Harlan's projected harvest range, calculated on a Sunday evening, with Mabel checking his arithmetic, was somewhere between 8,400 and 9,200 bushels. His forward contract with Merle Ashby covered 8,000 at $2.11. The remaining 400 to 1,200 would go to spot. He wrote, "If spot holds near contract price, this works. If spot drops below contract, still works. If spot rises above contract, this works considerably better." He closed the notebook. He said to Mabel, "I think we're going to be all right." Mabel was darning a sock by the kitchen window. She did not look up. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "How? You dug drainage trenches alone in 19-degree weather in February. A man doesn't do that for something he thinks is going to fail." She bit the thread and set the sock down and picked up the next one. Outside, 262 acres of soybeans were somewhere between knee-high and waist-high, depending on the section, and the pods were beginning to set, and the county of Reno, Kansas had already written its verdict on the whole enterprise and was waiting for the harvest to confirm it. October came cold and clear. The smell of cut stubble moved across the county roads on a northwest wind, and the sky was the particular blue that Kansas only produces in autumn, deep and serious and very far away. Harlan began harvest on October 3rd with a rented combine, $140 for the week, noted in the ledger as a temporary cost that would not repeat once he converted his own equipment over the winter. He hired 2 brothers, Curtis and Ray Alderman, at $1.90 an hour, 15 cents above the going rate. He wrote in the notebook, "Pay above market when you need reliable men in a short window. The difference in cost is negligible. The difference in reliability is not." Section A came in first. Harlan walked ahead of the combine in the early morning light, checking the pods by hand, feeling for shatter the dry splitting that drops yield before the machine reaches it. His timing was right. The pods were firm. The first wagon filled in 40 minutes. He ran the grain through his fingers. Dark yellow, clean, minimal splits, moisture at 13%. No drying required. He wrote that down standing in the field with the combine still running 50 yards behind him, because the combine did not wait for your notes. It took 9 days to cut all 262 acres. Section D came in below projection as expected. The replanted acres yielded thin and uneven, the clay pan doing exactly what the test holes in March had predicted it would do. He noted it without frustration. He had already accounted for it. The system had told him what Section D would do, and Section D had done it. Sections A, B, and C came in at 41.39 and 43 bushels per acre. Weighted average across all sections 36.4 bushels per acre. Total harvest 9,537 bushels. He sat in the cab of the rented combine on the last afternoon of cutting and looked at the number he had written on the corner of the page, and he understood not with excitement, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has tested a calculation against reality and found the calculation sound that what he had built this year was not just a crop, it was a proof. His forward contract covered 8,000 bushels at $2.11. That was $16,880. The remaining 1,537 went to spot at $2.19, adding $3,366. Total gross $20,246. Total inputs $6,890. Net income $13,356. On 262 acres, that was $50.97 per acre. His best wheat year, 1957, good moisture, clean harvest, strong market, had netted $33 per acre. He did not celebrate. He wrote the numbers at the bottom of the yield summary, drew a single line beneath them, and on the next page wrote the heading for 1960. Under it, one number, 400 acres. Then he drove to Hutchinson and walked into the office of Delbert Coyne at First National Bank, laid the yield summary and the elevator receipts on the desk, and walked out 40 minutes later with a $12,000 operating line for the coming season. He drove home past Clete Pruitt's wheat fields, brown and bare and exactly what they had always been. He drove past Kelsey's Feed and Supply on Plum Street. He did not stop. Between 1960 and 1964, Harlan Voss said very little in public about what he was doing. He sat in the back rows at co-op meetings and did not raise his hand. He bought his inputs through a supplier in Wichita rather than the local co-op, which saved him money on volume pricing and which was noticed and resented by the co-op manager in the particular quiet way that small county resentments operate, not confronted, just stored. He was not invited to be on the spring planning committee, which he had served on for 3 years running before 1959. He did not ask to be put back on it. He was quiet because talking cost time and time spent talking was time not spent in the notebook. In 1960, he planted 400 acres. He had converted his own combine over the winter for $890, permanent conversion noted as such. This is now a soybean operation and averaged 38.1 bushels per acre, netting $54. He used the profit to pay down the equipment note and purchase a used grain dryer he had been watching at an equipment auction in Pratt for 2 seasons. The dryer meant he could harvest slightly earlier without moisture penalties, which meant he could hit better spot pricing windows, which meant the dryer paid for itself in 2 years. Every purchase went through the same question written at the top of the relevant notebook page. Does this increase yield, reduce cost, or reduce risk? If not, it waits. 1961 brought the drought. Not a catastrophic drought, not the kind that men of his father's generation still talked about in lowered voices. This was the ordinary Kansas kind, where you needed 3.5 inches in June, and you got 2, and the difference showed up in yield numbers in October. Harlan's sections came in at 31.4 bushels per acre against a projection of 37. Net per acre dropped to $40. He did not panic. His reserve had been built specifically for this 2 consecutive poor seasons without emergency borrowing. He wrote in the notebook, 1961 drought year. Reserve held, no emergency debt required. System performed as designed. Not a good year, but a year the system had prepared for. There is a difference between surviving a bad year and having engineered your operation to absorb one without structural damage. Most of the men in Reno County could not have told you which category they were in until the bad year arrived and showed them. By the end of 1962, Harlan was farming 480 acres carrying no emergency debt and had net savings of $24,300 sitting in an account at First National that had not existed when he walked out of Kelsey's Feed and Supply in April 1959 and driven home to plant his first soybean crop alone. At the bottom of the 1962 year-end summary in the same compact hand he had been writing in since the first notebook, he added a single line under the financial totals. It read, Clete Pruitt, 160 acres north of County Road 17. Watch for availability. He had been watching Clete's operation for 3 years, not with eagerness, with the same observational discipline he applied to soil moisture readings and commodity price trends. The watching was simply part of how Harlan Voss understood the world around him by paying attention to it consistently and writing down what he saw. Cleet Pruitt ran good ground. That was the honest truth of it, and Harlan had no interest in pretending otherwise. The 160 acres north of the county road sat on some of the deepest topsoil in that section of Reno County, dark and rich, and with a moisture retention that his own south sections, with their variable clay content, could not match. Cleet's grandfather had broken that ground in 1908, and the 3 generations since had planted it in winter wheat every year with a consistency that was either discipline or stubbornness, depending on your perspective. The ground was excellent. The management was aging. Cleet ran the same rotation his father had run. He used the same input ratios adjusted only when prices forced him to. His equipment was old and maintained rather than upgraded, which was reasonable for a man who knew his machinery well, but which meant his harvest timing was constrained by what the old combine could do rather than what the crop needed. He had expanded his credit through the late 1950s on the assumption that wheat prices would continue to behave the way they had through most of the previous decade. They did not continue to behave that way. Interest rates on agricultural loans had been moving upwards since 1963, and wheat prices had not moved with them. Cleet's 1964 yield was adequate, 34 bushels per acre. Nothing alarming, but his input costs had risen 12%. From 1962, his equipment note had been refinanced once, and the operating loan he had taken in 1963 had been rolled into a larger note rather than retired. Harlan tracked this not through gossip, but through observation. A fence line not repaired along the north property edge. A section of field left fallow for a season, not a planned rotation fallow, but the fallow of a man managing cash flow rather than agronomics. Equipment sitting at the road's edge for a week at a time. The particular kind of deferred maintenance that spreads across an operation the way a crack spreads across a wall, slowly at first, then faster and always wider than it looks from a distance. He noted it in the notebook, not with satisfaction, with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. By December 1965, Cleet Pruitt owed the bank $47,000 against assets valued at approximately $61,000. Harlan did not know the exact figures. He knew the shape of the thing, which told him enough. The margin was $14,000 and shrinking. In the spring of 1966, Gus Fenner did something that surprised almost everyone who knew him. He asked questions. Not at the feed store counter, where the asking would have required a public admission that he was considering something he had publicly dismissed 7 years before. He asked Orrin Slade, the county extension agent, a careful, methodical man who visited operations twice a year and kept his opinions to himself unless someone asked for them directly. Gus asked Orrin about soybeans, about varieties, about soil requirements, about what kind of operation would need to change to support them. Orrin Slade mentioned in this conversation to Harlan on a Tuesday afternoon in May, in the way that county extension agents pass along information without quite passing along information, leaving it to the recipient to decide what to do with it. Harlan said he would be willing to talk to Gus if Gus wanted to talk. They met at Kelsey's Feed and Supply on Plum Street. The same counter, the same coffee, and the same heavy ceramic cups. It was a Wednesday morning and the place was quiet. They sat at the counter, and Gus Fenner, who had stood at this same counter in April 1959 and laughed, asked every question he had. Harlan answered every one. He showed Gus yield numbers from 3 counties printed from the Extension Service data he had been collecting since 1960. He explained the forward contract structure and how to find a crush facility to work with. He recommended 2 varieties suited to Gus's soil type based on what he knew of the ground, lighter, sandier than Harlan's sections, better drainage, different moisture dynamic. He did not mention April 1959. He did not mention the counter or the coffee cup set down deliberately or the laughter that had followed him out the door. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical than forgiveness. Gus Fenner had 600 acres and was ready to make a decision that would change what those acres produced, and the information Harlan had was directly relevant to that decision. And withholding it because of something that had happened 7 years ago at a feed store counter was not something a serious man did. Harlan was a serious man. Gus converted 120 acres in the spring of 1967. His first soybean harvest came in at $49 per acre net. He told his wife Norma that evening that it was the best single agricultural decision he had made in 10 years of farming. He did not publicly credit Harlan Voss for the information or the conversation. Harlan did not expect him to. What happened to Cleet Pruitt through 1966 and into early 1967 followed the pattern that debt follows when it outgrows the operation carrying it. Slowly at first, then in ways that couldn't be undone. The 1965 wheat harvest had come in at 28 bushels per acre. Not catastrophic, but Cleat's input costs had risen 14% from 1963, and the equipment note had been refinanced a second time, and the 1964 operating loan had been consolidated into a larger note at a rate that made the monthly carrying cost a structural problem before the crop was even planted. The bank was patient in the way that banks are patient right up until they aren't. In March of 1967, First National called Cleat's operating note. Harlan heard about this on a Tuesday afternoon, the same way he heard most things in Reno County, through the particular information network of men who work land adjacent to other men's land and pay attention to what moves and what doesn't. On Wednesday morning, before he drove to the South Fields to check soil temperature in preparation for spring planting, he stopped in Hutchinson and sat down across from Delbert Coyne at First National Bank. He did not ask about Cleat's situation. He knew Delbert could not discuss another customer's account, and he would not have put Delbert in that position. What he asked was a carefully specific question: if a purchase opportunity arose on the 160 acres north of County Road 17, in the next 12 months, what would the bank's general posture be toward a buyer with clean financials and a current operating line? Delbert Coyne was a careful man. He said he couldn't speak to specifics. He suggested that any buyer in that position would want to ensure their financing documentation was current and complete. Harlan thanked him, shook his hand, and drove back toward the farm. He did not go directly to the fields. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he got home without opening the notebook, without picking up a pencil. Outside, the March light was flat and gray, and the soil was still too cold to work. There was nothing to do yet that required doing. He had waited for this window since 1962. Not impatiently, patience was not the right word for what those 5 years had been. It had been something quieter than patience. The understanding that the right moment was not something you created. It was something you prepared for and then recognized when it arrived, and then moved on without hesitation. The window was open now. He updated every financial document in his files that afternoon. Clean figures, current balances, the operating line in good standing, the land holdings documented and appraised. Everything a bank would want to see from a serious buyer. He planted 480 acres that spring. He kept the notebooks current. He kept the financials clean. He kept the reserve intact. He did not contact Cleat Pruitt. The land was not going anywhere. Only the debt on it was moving, and debt, once it started moving in the wrong direction, did not stop on its own. He had learned that from watching 3 operations in Reno County over the past decade, and he had no need to learn it again. He went back to the field. He waited. The conversation between Harlan Voss and Cleat Pruitt happened on a Thursday afternoon in September of 1967 in the gravel driveway of Cleat's farm, with a northwest wind pulling at the dry grass along the fence line, and Cleat's old shepherd dog sleeping in the shade of a truck that hadn't moved in 3 weeks. Harlan had called ahead that morning. He had not shown up unannounced. That mattered to him in a way that was difficult to articulate, but was nonetheless real. There was a difference between arriving at a man's property to discuss his circumstances and ambushing him in them, and Harlan had no interest in the latter. Cleat had said to come at 2 o'clock. Harlan arrived at 2 o'clock. Cleat was standing in the driveway when he pulled in. He was 48 years old and looked it in the particular way that financial strain ages a man, not through illness or injury, but through the cumulative weight of a problem carried too long without resolution. His hair had gone mostly gray since Harlan had last seen him up close. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his shoulders set in the manner of a man who already knew what the conversation was going to be and had decided somewhere between Tuesday and Thursday that he was going to get through it without letting it show too much. Harlan got out of this truck. They shook hands. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The dog lifted its head from the shade of the stationary truck, looked at Harlan without particular interest, and put its head back down. "Appreciate you coming out," Cleat said. "Appreciate you having me," Harlan said. They stood there in the gravel, and the wind moved through the fence line with the dry sound of autumn, and Harlan said what he had come to say. He offered $42,000 for the 160 acres north of County Road 17. Cash closing within 30 days. That was $262.50 per acre. The market in Reno County that fall was running $230 to $250 for comparable ground. Harlan had priced it above market deliberately, and he had thought carefully about that decision before making it. He had written in the notebook the previous evening, offer above market, reflects actual value to this operation, avoids the negotiation that comes from a man feeling cornered, closes clean. Cleet was quiet for a long time after Harlan said the number. He looked at the ground. He looked at the fence line. He looked at something in the middle distance that was probably not anything specific, but was the kind of looking a man does when he is working through something he hasn't finished working through yet. Then he said, "You've been watching that ground for a while, Harlan." "Since about 1962, Harlan said. Cleet absorbed that. 5 years. Closer to 6. "How come you never said anything?" Harlan looked at him steadily. "It wasn't available." Something shifted in Cleet's expression. Not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. The expression of a man who has just been handed an honest answer and recognizes it as such even if the honesty is not entirely comfortable. "You're going to put beans on it," Cleet said. It was not a question. "Yes," Harlan said. The wind moved through the fence line again. The dog slept. Somewhere south on the county road, a truck passed and faded, and the silence came back the way Kansas silence always came back, completely, as if the sound had never been there at all. Then Cleet said, "My father would have thought you were out of your mind in 1959. Harlan said, "A lot of people did. I was one of them." A pause long enough to hold everything it needed to hold. "At Kelsey's, the counter." "I remember," Harlan said. "Yeah." Cleet looked out at the north field, 160 acres of dark Kansas topsoil that his grandfather had broken in 1908, that his father had planted every spring for 40 years, that he himself had put into wheat every season of his adult life. "I suppose you do." Harlan did not say anything to that. He waited. A man who had spent 8 years building something by not rushing it knew how to wait through a silence. Cleet said, "Let me think on it through the weekend." "Take the time you need," Harlan said. They shook hands again. Harlan got in the truck and drove south on County Road 17 and did not look in the mirror. Cleet called on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. He said yes. The closing happened on October 14, 1967, at First National Bank in Hutchinson, in a room with a rectangular table and fluorescent lighting, and the particular institutional quiet of a place where significant things happen without ceremony. Delbert Coyne handled the paperwork. The transaction took 40 minutes. Harlan signed where indicated and wrote the check himself, $42,000 drawn on the savings account at First National that had not existed in any form on the morning in April 1959, when Cleet Pruitt had set his coffee cup down on the counter at Kelsey's Feed and Supply and said what he had said. Cleet signed the deed transfer. They shook hands across the table. Cleet said, "Take care of it." "I will," Harlan said. There was nothing else to say, and both of them seemed to understand that, and so nothing else was said. Harlan drove home on an October afternoon with 160 additional acres of Reno County topsoil in his name, and the fields on either side of County Road 17 were brown and cut and empty under the October sky, and the light was the low amber light of autumn in the Great Plains, going flat toward the horizon. That evening, he opened the 7th green notebook. He wrote North 160, formerly Pruitt, acquired October 14, 1967, $42,000 cash. Deep topsoil, strong moisture retention, superior to south sections A through F. Drainage correction required southwest corner. Plan for 1968 planting. He noted the drainage problem before he noted the acquisition price. It was the order that made sense to him. The drainage problem was actionable. The acquisition price was history. Mabel was at the kitchen table when he came in from the desk. She had a cup of tea and was reading, and she looked up when he sat down across from her. "Did you say anything to him?" she said. "About 1959? Harlan considered the question the way he considered questions that deserve consideration rather than quick answers. "I paid him a fair price," he said. Mabel looked at him for a moment. "So that's what you said." "That's what I said." She held his eyes for another moment, and in the quiet that followed, the particular quiet of two people who have been married long enough to understand what the other one means without requiring them to say all of it, she looked back at her book. The kitchen held the silence the way the good Kansas soil held moisture, completely without waste. Between 1968 and 1972, Harlan Voss acquired ground the way a careful man acquires anything, not through aggression, not through waiting for catastrophe, but through being prepared and present when the moment came, and the moment was legitimate. A 120-acre parcel from the estate of a farmer named George Parr in 1969, whose sons had moved to Wichita and had no attachment to the land beyond what it was worth on a balance sheet. They sold to Harlan because he had been their father's most reliable neighboring tenant on the east fence line, and because his offer was clean and his closing was fast, and there were no contingencies. An 80-acre piece from Gus Fenner in 1971 offered to Harlan before it went to anyone else. Gus had been consolidating for 2 years, moving toward retirement on a reduced footprint, and when the time came to sell the east parcel, he called Harlan first. He told his wife Norma that Harlan would take care of the ground. That was the reason he gave. It was the right reason. A 200-acre block in 1972 from an operation that had gone through the bank, a foreclosure that Delbert Coyne had managed with the reluctance of a man who had been in agricultural lending long enough to understand what it costs a family to lose land. Harlan made a clean cash offer 3 days after the bank acquired title. Delbert called him the same afternoon. The offer was accepted by the end of the week. By the end of 1972, Harlan Voss farmed 960 acres. He had not set out to farm 960 acres. He had set out to read a government bulletin more carefully than his neighbors plant a crop they had laughed at and build an operation that could survive what farming threw at it without breaking. The 960 acres was what happened when you did those things consistently for 13 years without stopping and without varying the fundamental approach. His 1974 gross revenue was $198,400. Net after all costs, $89,000. The median household income in the United States in 1974 was $12,902. Harlan was netting 7 times that from a crop that the men at Kelsey's Feed and Supply had laughed at on a Tuesday morning in April of 1959. He did not think about that fact often. When he did think about it, it was not with the satisfaction of a man proved right. It was with the more complicated feeling of a man who understood that being right and being willing to act on being right are 2 entirely different things, and that the second one is considerably rarer than the first. In the summer of 1974, a reporter from the Hutchinson News named Tom Garrett came to write about soybean farming in Reno County. He had been told by the county extension office that Harlan Voss was the longest tenured and most systematically documented soybean operation in the region, and he drove out on a Wednesday morning with a notepad and sat across from Harlan at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Harlan showed him everything: the yield records going back to 1959, the soil maps from the original 47 test holes, the forward contract history, every contract since the first one he had signed with Merle Ashby in Wichita in April of 1959. The notebook shelf above the desk, 7 volumes by then, 8 by year's end, each labeled on the spine in the same small cursive. Tom Garrett asked his questions in the way that reporters ask questions when they are trying to find the human center of something that looks on the surface like an agricultural story. "When did you know it was going to work?" he asked. Harlan said October 1959. When the first harvest came in. "And before that, when you planted, did you know then?" "I knew the numbers were right," Harlan said. "That's different from knowing it's going to work." The reporter wrote that down. Then he looked up. "When people laughed at you, the men at the feed store your neighbors did that bother you?" Harlan was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, he could see the south fields and beyond the tree line, the beginning of the north sections that had been Cleet Pruitt's ground, and before that, Cleet's father's ground, and before that, unbroken prairie. 880 acres of soybeans were 3 weeks from harvest, the rows clean and even the plants heavy with pods in the September heat. "It bothered me," he said. He paused. "Then I went back to the field." Tom Garrett closed his notepad and looked around the kitchen. The heavy table worn smooth at its edges, the drawer under the telephone, the shelf of green notebooks visible through the office doorway. "Is there anything you'd want other farmers to take from your story?" he asked. Harlan thought about that for a moment. "Open the envelope," he said. Garrett looked up from his notepad. "I'm sorry. Whatever came in this mail this week that you set aside because it looked like government paper. Open it. Read the whole thing. Most people don't." Garrett wrote that down. It ran as the last line of the article. The piece appeared on a Sunday. It was the lead story in the farm section with a photograph of Harlan standing at the edge of the north fields in his work jacket with 880 acres of soybeans behind him. Mabel read it at the kitchen table that morning and said the photograph was a good one. Harlan read it once and thought Tom Garrett had gotten the numbers right, which was the main thing. In a farmhouse 12 miles north, Cleet Pruitt read the article at his own kitchen table on 120 fewer acres than he had farmed in 1966. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it on top of the refrigerator and did not mention it to his wife and did not take it down for a long time. Harlan Voss farmed until the spring of 1990. Not because his body gave out. He was 62 and still walked his fields every evening, the way he always had, slowly checking soil moisture, with 2 fingers pressed 2 inches into the ground, reading the season by what the earth told his hands. He could have farmed another decade in the physical sense of the word. What changed in the spring of 1990 was Mabel. The diagnosis came in March, delivered by a doctor in Hutchinson, in the quiet, careful language that doctors use when the news is serious and the outcome uncertain. It was the kind of diagnosis that rearranges the arithmetic of everything else. Not immediately, not all at once, but completely. The way a structural shift rearranges a market. From the floor up. Harlan sat in the truck in the hospital parking lot for a long time after that appointment. He did not get out a pencil. He did not calculate anything. There was nothing to calculate. There was only the single clear fact of what mattered, which he had always known, and which did not require a notebook to confirm. He arranged the lease of all 960 acres to a farm management company out of Wichita on 3-year terms with operators he vetted personally through references and 1 in-person conversation each, because the ground deserved that level of attention, and he had always given it that level of attention, and he was not going to stop now simply because he was no longer the one doing the planning. He kept the land. He did not sell an acre of it. But the farming, the daily work of it, the planting decisions and the harvest timing, and the notebook that had been his companion for 31 years, he let that go. He spent the next 3 years with Mabel. They were not dramatic years in the way that stories often make the final years of a life seem. They were ordinary years in the best sense, meals at the kitchen table, evenings on the porch, watching the light go flat over the fields. Mabel in her garden through the springs and summers that her health permitted, cutting back the rows a little each season, but keeping after it with the same practical attention she had brought to everything in her life. The garden had been hers since the first spring of their marriage in 1952. 38 years of growing things in that half acre on the south side of the house, through the drought years and the good years, through the seasons when the farm carried debt that required careful management, and the seasons when it didn't. Through the raising of 2 daughters, through every morning when Harlan had gone to the field, and every evening when he had come back. It had always been there when he returned. Mabel died in the summer of 1993. She was 64 years old. The garden went untended that year, not because Harlan forgot it or neglected it deliberately, but because some things are particular to a person in a way that makes them impossible to continue in the immediate aftermath of that person being gone. The garden was Mabel's in a way that went beyond ownership. It was hers the way the notebooks were. Harlan's not just a possession, but an expression of how she moved through the world, what she believed about the relationship between attention and outcome, between care and what care produces. That summer, the tomatoes she had planted in April before the diagnosis worsened came up without her and fruited without her and dropped without her, and Harlan let them. In the spring of 1994, he planted the garden himself, smaller than it had been. 3 tomato plants, 2 rows of beans, a short row of sweet corn along the south fence. He worked the soil the way he had watched Mabel work it for 4 decades, slowly, carefully on his knees, in the early morning when the light was still low and the air had the coolness of night still in it. He kept it up that season and the next and the one after that, reducing the footprint slightly each year, as his knees made longer sessions harder, but never letting it go entirely. He kept it until he couldn't. Harlan Voss died in the spring of 2001 at the age of 73 in the farmhouse where he had sat at the kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning in January of 1959 and read a 14-page government bulletin that everyone else in Reno County had put in a drawer. The land was worth $1.4 million at the time of settlement. The equipment and infrastructure on the property appraised at an additional $340,000. In his office above the desk, where he had written his yield summaries and soil notes and quiet observations about neighboring operations, for 32 years there was a shelf with 23 green composition notebooks arranged in chronological order, each one labeled on the spine in his small compact cursive. 1959 Volume 1, 1959 Volume 2, 1959 Volume 3. Continuing through to 1991, the last year he had farmed the ground himself before turning it over and turning toward Mabel. His daughter Loretta drove down from Salina the week after the service and spent 3 days in his office. She read all 23 notebooks. What she found was not what she had expected to find, and she had not been sure what she expected. She had grown up in this house, had watched her father go to the field in the morning and come back in the evening. For the first 18 years of her life had understood from an early age that he was a serious man who kept his own counsel and measured things carefully before acting on them. She had known about the notebooks, had seen them on the shelf since she was a child, but had never read them. What was in them was a system. Yield tables and soil observations and equipment records and price analysis and contract evaluations and weather notes and drainage project documentation and labor cost tracking and land acquisition calculations going back to the first harvest of 1959. Every decision and its reasoning, every failure and what it had taught him, every year of quiet accumulation that had looked from the outside like a man farming his ground and minding his business. From the inside in the notebooks, it was something else entirely. It was a life conducted with complete deliberateness. Not a lucky life, a designed one. Not a dramatic one, a consistent one. Built on the simple discipline of reading what was in front of you and believing it even when no one else did, and then going back to work and then doing it again the next day and the day after that and every day for 32 years without varying the fundamental approach and without needing anyone else to understand what you were doing or why. The notebooks contained no reflections on what any of it had meant, no entries about the men who had laughed at the feed store counter, no record of how it had felt to write a $42,000 check to the man who had set his coffee cup down and said what he had said in April of 1959. No comment on the Hutchinson News article or Tom Garrett's questions, or the photograph of a man standing at the edge of his north field with 880 acres of soybeans behind him. None of that was in the notebooks. There was one exception. On the last page of the 1991 notebook, the final volume, the one that ended when he handed the operation to the management company and turned his attention to the woman who had asked about break-even prices at a kitchen table in February of 1959, and then told him she was keeping her garden, Harlan had written a single paragraph. Single. Not a table. Not a numbered entry. Just a paragraph in the same small cursive, slightly looser than the earlier years, the hand of a man in his early 60s who had been writing in these notebooks for 32 years and whose fingers knew the motion of it, the way a farmer's fingers know the motion of checking soil, moisture automatically without thinking about it, as natural as breathing. It said, the ground doesn't care who's right. It gives back what you put in and sometimes less, and you plan for that. What I learned was not about soybeans. It was about reading what's in front of you and believing it even when no one else does, and then going back to work. I tried to do it correctly. I think I mostly did. Below that in darker pencil, added later the handwriting slightly different, written at a different time and with a different weight behind it. Mabel kept her garden until she couldn't. That was the right way to do it. Loretta read that paragraph 4 times. Then she closed the notebook and sat in her father's office in the quiet of a Kansas farmhouse, in the particular stillness of early spring, when the fields outside are not yet planted, and the soil is still cold, and the year has not yet decided what it is going to be. 23 green notebooks on the shelf. 960 acres outside the window, leased now managed by operators. Her father had vetted personally the ground in better condition than when he had first started farming it, because that was the point, not just to use the land, but to leave it better than you found it. That had never been written in any notebook. It had never needed to be. She sat there for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen to make coffee, and on her way past the drawer under the telephone, she stopped. She opened it. The brown paper bag from Dylan's was still there, slightly crumpled, folded in quarters, covered in pencil figures in her father's hand. The arithmetic of a decision made 42 years before she found it, calculated at 3:47 in the morning, at this same kitchen table by a 31-year-old man who hadn't been able to sleep and had opened a drawer looking for a tractor payment schedule and had found something else entirely. She held it for a moment. The numbers were clear even after all this time. The pencil had gone into the paper with the particular pressure of a man writing fast in the middle of the night, trying to get the calculation down before the logic of it slipped away. Column after column of figures in the compact hand she had known her entire life. Cost per acre, projected yield, contract price, net at various spot price scenarios. At the bottom circled once plant soybeans. Loretta stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse where she had grown up, holding a grocery bag full of arithmetic that had changed everything, and she understood in the way that you understand things when you are standing in the place where they happened, with the evidence of them in your hands, that the distance between the men who had laughed at the feed store counter and her father had not been intelligence or vision or courage. It had been simpler than that. They had received the same envelope. They had put it in the drawer. He had opened the drawer at 2 in the morning and read what was inside. All of it. Every page. That was all. That was everything. She put the bag back in the drawer. Some things just need to be kept. Claude Fable 5 is currently